Hello everyone, welcome to this channel. Our channel narrates the life stories of our viewers from all around the world. To protect individuals' privacy, names are sometimes altered in these stories. My name is Mehrat and I'm 35 years old. The story I want to share is recent. My life has been quite complicated, largely due to my family situation. From what I remember, my parents always had issues with each other, and it was due to their forced marriage. At first, they didn't show me their conflicts much, but I could sense how troubled they were, which had a negative impact on me. Most of the time, I was absorbed in my own world, and sometimes I really worried that I might lose them and be left alone. All the arguing and fighting eventually made me a reclusive and depressed person who struggled to connect with others. My older brother, Mehdi, was similar and we only occasionally spent time together. We were going through a tough time and no one seemed to care about us. Years passed and I grew up. By the time I was a teenager, the emotions I had repressed during my childhood began to surface. I became quite aggressive, and as I got older, this behavior became more pronounced. I went from being a reclusive child to a young man who attended many parties and drank alcohol. By the age of 19, after finishing school, my friend Milad and I decided to study for a couple of months to get into a good university. He was like a brother to me. Despite being far behind in my studies, I had no choice but to focus on them, despite the ongoing arguments and poor conditions at home. During that time, things at home were very chaotic, with my parents arguing more than ever and only waiting for opportunity to end everything. My brother Mehdi spent most of his time at his friends' houses to avoid the toxic atmosphere at home. I spent most of my time with Milad. I took various exams and during that period I saw a girl in our neighborhood. From the first moment I saw her, I fell for her deeply and wanted to connect with her. But I was a little afraid she might reject me. And I had a lot of pride that made it hard for me to handle rejection. Eventually, I mustered up the courage, found her through social media and told her how I felt about her, without any preamble. After a few hours of not receiving a response, she finally came online and started chatting. From her words, it was clear she had seen me in the neighborhood as well. The living conditions in our area were somehow better compared to others, and we were somehow visible. In our conversation, she kept saying she needed time to get to know me better and that it was better if we took things slowly. Seeing that she had a point, I decided to proceed more calmly and slowly. I started dating Mahsa and I was very excited. It took about a month for her to officially agree to be my girlfriend. My feelings for her went beyond that short period. I had been watching her for a while and had grown fond of her. I could easily hug and kiss her, although we hadn't been intimate yet. And let me mention that she often asked about my father's income, which I didn't like it. After 2 or 3 months, when my exam results came out, I was happy because I could pursue a good job and field of study. A few days later, I got into a fight with someone outside and called Mehdi for help because they wanted to take me to the police station. He was driving then and suddenly the call was disconnected. I called him several times but he didn't answer. I was worried until my phone rang. and it was Mehdi's number. When I answered, a strange man told me that Mehdi had been in an accident and was in critical condition. And he also gave me the accident location. But since I was being taken to the police station, I could only inform my father. At that time, due to the severe altercation I had with the person in the street, which was somewhat a result of my argument with Mahsa the night before, I was taken to the police station. I was worried about my brother's condition and knew someone had to come and post bail or be a guarantor for me to get out. I spent that night in extreme stress and anxiety, worrying that if something happened to Mehdi, it would be my fault for calling him at the wrong time. The next day, I hadn't even slept when a soldier called my name. They brought me the bail documents and I was released. I thought my father had come, but in reality, he had given the documents to one of his workers. When I got home, all the walls were covered with black banners and everyone was crying. I found out that my brother had passed away. My father came to me. He slapped me hard and said that I caused him to lose control of the car. And that's why he is no longer alive. He wanted to fight me, and others had to pull him away. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water was poured over me. How could this be? None of us were in good condition. Right there, I burst into tears, overwhelmed with grief. How could I believe this? After Mehdi's death, everything fell apart. My father officially kicked me out of his life, blamed me for Mehdi's death, and took away everything he had given me, money, the car, and so on. I was essentially cast out of my family, in a terrible situation where I was constantly thinking about my brother. But now I had to rely on Milad and live with him. I expected Mahsa to be there for me and make me feel better, but she grew distant. Once she knew I had been kicked out of the house, she spoke to me much less, as if I had become a stranger to her. Eventually, one night, she blocked me everywhere and said she could no longer stay in touch with me and that I was no longer a part of her life. I was in shock. Everyone was abandoning me, and it became clear that the girl I loved so much had only been interested in me for my financial status and was now pulling away. After some time, I tried to pull myself together and went to work. I kept myself busy with work all day. My mother kept calling, pleading with me to come back home, saying that she didn't want to lose her second son. But my pride wouldn't let me return to the house that had rejected me. I worked half the day at a large restaurant and the other half at a store. At least I had an income, and the restaurant job paid relatively well, allowing me to save some money. About a year after Mehdi's death, my mother called me and said she had been negotiating with my father about my return home and had eventually divorced him. She had received the house and a car, and she asked me to come live with her. I couldn't believe it. My mother had divorced my father because he had not forgiven me, even though there had been a sense of love between them despite their differences. After much internal struggle, I realized returning to my mother was the best option for me. This way, I wouldn't be a burden on Milad. Although I still stayed in touch with him and we even worked together. Sometimes he felt like Mehdi to me. Now I had a place to live and my mother was no longer alone. So I moved in with my mother. She said she would transfer the house to my name and the car would be mine. But I wanted to work and build my own assets. I had fallen deeply into depression and had turned from the lively and mischievous young man I was a couple of years ago into a depressed person. My life had become all about work and university, and I didn't think about love anymore because I was afraid of being alone again. Then, after a year or two since my brother's death, my cousin Nestaran constantly reached out to me, both in person and online. One night, she sent me a message saying that despite it being difficult for her to put aside her pride, she had feelings for me since childhood and liked me. I didn't want to make a hasty decision, so I consulted with the psychiatrist I was seeing, who said it wouldn't be bad to give myself a new opportunity. Slowly, I tried to connect with her and leave the past behind, and I informed my mother as well. I proceeded cautiously for the first 4 months, just getting to know her and allowing my feelings to develop. As I got to know her better, our relationship grew stronger and more intimate. But this time it was based on reason and logic rather than teenage emotions and excitement. After a long time of knowing each other, I confessed my feelings to her and we became more intimate. Nasara would frequently ask me odd questions about how many girlfriends I had, among other things in our conversations. Milad was aware of all the events in our relationship and even had gone out with Nasaran a few times. We formed a trio with Milad. Eventually, when I felt I knew Nasaran well enough, I decided to marry her because I was turning 24 and wanted to settle down quickly. So my mother and I went to propose. My aunt was supportive and everyone was waiting for Nasaran's answer, which she said yes. After a few days, we got engaged, and now I could be with her comfortably and very easily. It's worth mentioning that I used some of the money my father had left for us for investment, and Milad also contributed some money so we could become partners. I and Milad started a very successful boutique that became quite popular from the beginning. Now I no longer needed to work at the restaurant. Milad kept saying that this girl wasn't right for me. And when I asked him why, he gave ridiculous reason that I didn't take them seriously. After a while into my engagement with Nasaran, I felt that Mehdi's loneliness was bothering him and that he was a bit envious of my life, though I didn't let it show. During the 6 months we were engaged, whenever Nasaran and I went somewhere, Milad would come along. Then one day Milad came to the boutique and said he wanted to get married. I thought he was joking until he said, "No, I'm serious. I'm marrying with my cousin Nargis. Remember? You had a crush on her for a while." I suddenly remembered what a great girl she was. Even though I was getting married, I asked if he really liked Nargis and he nodded and said yes. A few days later, Milad also got engaged. Within a few days, our group of friends became 4. Since Nasaran was my cousin, I didn't want things to move too quickly. So we decided to stay engaged a bit longer and then have a grand wedding before starting our life together. That's exactly what happened. Even though there wasn't much closeness between Nasaran and me during the engagement, I sometimes felt she was distant, perhaps due to her shyness. However, every time I saw Nargis, who had quickly gotten engaged to Milad, I felt a certain way. She truly looked like an angel, and I couldn't understand why Milad said his marriage to her wasn't out of love. After a while, when Milad couldn't convince me to call off my engagement with Nasaran, he quickly married Nargis and even praised her. saying he was very lucky. Our engagement period was quite long, so we had a very large wedding. My mother gave me my share of the house so I could find a good home for Nastaran and myself. And she also gave me the car since she didn't have a license. That night after the ceremony, Nastaran and I went to our new home. I was very excited about our wedding night and the prospect of being intimate with her. Once we were alone, I couldn't wait and started undressing her. I could see the desire in her eyes and wanted to make her as ready as possible before proceeding. After some affection, I noticed her eyes were half closed, so I laid her on the bed. As she was very eager, I stayed close to her and we were very intimate. Nastaran and I started a good life together and I was satisfied with everything. For the first 5 months of our marriage, I worked only at the boutique with Milad. But since living expenses were high, I added online sales to my work and spent most of my time at the boutique to manage the life that Nastaran deserved. After a while, I felt that Nastaran was unhappy because she constantly complained about me working all day. Additionally, our group outings decreased. Although Milad's wife, would often bring lunch and food to the boutique for Milad, Nastaran kept complaining and insisted on involving Milad and his wife in our life. One time I came home to find that Nastaran had prepared a lavish dinner and invited them over without informing me. I started feeling bad about this situation because I knew Nastaran didn't get along well with Nergis and often spoke poorly of her. Even though from what I had seen, Nergis was genuinely kind and liked Nastaran a lot. The happiness in my life with Nastaran only lasted the first 6 months. Gradually, she began finding more faults and didn't understand all my efforts to provide a better life for her. She kept comparing our life with others, saying things like, "Look at Milad, his house is much better than us." She didn't consider that Milad's father had provided everything for him. Hearing these comments bothered me and created distance between us. Additionally, Nastaran had become less affectionate and seemed to be growing cold towards me. She enjoyed going out with Milad and his wife more than spending time with me. Naturally, any man would feel bad and exhausted in this situation. When you put in so much effort to make someone happy and they don't appreciate it, life becomes frustrating. At this time, Milad also seemed dissatisfied with his life. Every time Nargis brought him food, he accepted reluctantly, which wasn't fair to her. Nargis was a girl who had many suitors better than Milad deserved better. Sometimes I tried to talk him and tell him that treating his wife this way wasn't right. After all, I knew firsthand how hard it is to be ignored by someone you love, and Nastaran was doing that. But his response was, "No matter how beautiful or charming she is, she doesn't appeal to me." I thought love would develop over time, but it never did, and I never fell in love with her. Living like this is hard for me. I told him that she had turned down many people for him. In fact, she had even told me so herself. But he just said he had no feelings for her. Once he opened up to me and said that he had feelings for someone else who had since married, so he felt he had to get married too. However, the person was always on his mind. It was the first time he talked about something like this, though he didn't specify who he was talking about, but it was clear he had deeply loved someone. I found his actions hard to justify, especially since he sometimes flirted with other girls online. I felt sorry for poor Nargis. Then one night I suddenly saw that Nargis had sent me a follow request on social media. This was about 2 or 3 years after my marriage, and despite Nestaran's cold behavior, I was trying to love her. I followed her back, but no messages were exchanged between us. Nestaran's birthday was coming up, and I decided to throw a big party for her, inviting Milad and Nargis as well. I wanted to do something to make her forget any difficulties and make our life like it was at the beginning. I reserved a restaurant and coordinated with Milad and Nargis to come there in advance. Everything was set for a grand celebration. When I took Nastaran to the restaurant, Milad and Nargis surprised her with a lot of excitement, and she was genuinely surprised. However, it didn't take long for her to start complaining again. She joked in front of them and saying things like, "You could have booked a bigger restaurant," or "The cream on the cake was terrible. I hope I don't get a stomachache." Nargis looked at her strangely. Despite my efforts to give her a great birthday, she could only find faults and didn't even smile to make me happy. After dinner, she suddenly got up from the table and went to the restroom, then complained that the cake was so bad she ended up throwing up. I was deeply hurt by her words and stepped outside the restaurant for a few minutes. Milad came after me and said, "You know from the start how she is. She's always been like this. Don't take it personally. She's always been pampered and hasn't seen any hardships. That's why she behaves this way." That night we went home and I thought I could improve the situation with Nestaran, but her behavior had left me feeling so bad that I realized it wasn't going to work. I was very depressed, and without even thanking me, she went to the bed. I knew she had many fantasies in her mind, like dining at the most expensive restaurant in town and having an entire cake. But I had done my best within my means, and it went unnoticed. While I was browsing social media, Nargis suddenly messaged me saying, "I'm really sorry about Nasaran's behavior tonight. You truly made every effort, and it shouldn't have ended up like this. Don't be upset and ashamed. Milad and I are not strangers." I slowly opened up to her. I was so upset and needed to vent to someone. And it was about 4 a.m. before she finally stopped listening. I asked, "Why aren't you asleep yet?" And she said Milad wasn't home and was at the boutique for work. But I knew the boutique had no work at that time of night. It wasn't long before she shared her own issues with Milad, and I completely understood her. Nargis and I continued to talk calmly and share our life experiences. Over the next 2 to 3 months, she began to openly discuss her problems with Milad, and I also expressed how I was fed up with Nasaran's behavior. Although I married for love, Nasaran's attitude had driven things to this point. Eventually, I asked Nargis to come out and be my guest since Milad didn't do that for her. After we had a meal together, we continued to see each other, and as time went by, I developed feelings for her. However, I lacked the courage to say the word divorce to Nastaran, even though our marriage had long been falling apart. After about 5 months of staying in touch, one day when Milad avoided going to the boutique and I suspected he might be going after another girl, Nargis wanted to see me. I went to see her and we drove outside the city so no one would see us. While I was driving, I gently placed my hand on her leg. She resisted a bit and was shy, but I continued, and then I pulled over and we began. Her shyness was still visible in her eyes, but both of us needed it. We hadn't been close with our spouses for a long time. I realized the car wasn't a good place, so I took her to a small garden we had. Her shyness had diminished and we continued. Afterwards, I felt a bit of guilt that night. I had been intimate with my partner's wife, who was also a friend. However, seeing how Milad and Nestan were indifferent to us, I felt my actions weren't entirely wrong. Nargis and I had developed feelings for each other, and after that time, we were together a couple more times, both in the same garden. Nargis was truly a kind and lovable person. I kept thinking about how Mila didn't appreciate her. The next time we planned to be together, Nastaran said she would go to her mother's house for a couple of days. I was used to her sudden departures, so I left the boutique to Milad and went home to invite Nargis. While we were together, I suddenly heard someone coming up the stairs. I thought it must be from the apartment above. Then I saw Milad standing at the door. He had gotten suspicious about my recent actions and followed me and had caught me here. I was stunned and tried to speak, but he said he didn't care about Nargis and threatened me, saying he would make sure I suffered. He hit me a few times. I didn't defend myself. He also hit Nargis and then left. He acted as if I didn't know about his own infidelity with Nargis. After he left, Nargis was very upset and I told her that Milad had cheated on her several times from the beginning. I calmed her down a bit and sent her to her mother's house. I hoped Milad wouldn't tell Nastaran anything. I went to the boutique and found no sign of Milad. I was worried all night, with no news of either Milad or Nastaran. I could barely sleep. I spoke a lot with Nargis, reassured her, and promised to marry her after all this. The next day there was still no news of them. I expected Milad to tell Nastaran everything and ruin my life, but it seemed they had disappeared. That night, Milad called me and said that he had taken my wife and that the disgrace would remain with me forever. I was furious and could hardly breathe. I hung up. Some time passed since then. The incident brought me significant shame, and everyone said my wife had run away with my friend, although I knew I was partly to blame. I later realized that Milad and Nastaran had been involved even before Nargis and I were together. I divorced Nastaran in absentia and cut off contact with her family. I had always suspected something between them. They just portrayed themselves as victims. It took some time for Milad to divorce Nargis as he wanted to torment her. But eventually Nargis received her divorce papers and then we married. Despite all that happened, we have a good life together.